Hey everybody, I just today want to talk about a quick response that I recently wrote an article about to a common argument I'm seeing by the WMSCOG to when we talk about Ahnsahnghong's book and we talk about his book where he refutes Mother God. Let me pull that up real quick. So the problems with the New Jerusalem, the bride and women's veils. We've done several of these, several videos talking about this book, and a common response we've seen that I'm going to talk about is this. It's that they'll use the scripture from, I believe it's somewhere in Luke, I think. Let me pull that up real quick. So actually Matthew, but it's probably in both Matthew and Luke. So in Matthew 16:23, we look at the book Ahnsahnghong wrote, where he very obviously refuted the doctrine of Mother God. And the response that's been common in the comments to these arguments, the response from the WMSCOG is to bring up Matthew 16:23, where Jesus calls Peter Satan. And so this is a situation where Peter he was not acting in line with the truth. His mind was on worldly things, and so so Jesus acknowledged and recognized the fact that Peter in that moment was not in line with the truth, and so he was actually acting as Satan's mouthpiece. And so what the WMSCOG does basically is they say that in the same way that Ahnsahnghong refuted Mother God, but today they believe that he eventually believed in her and taught that she was a reality, and so they equate that to the fact that Peter called Jesus, or Jesus called Peter Satan, but today we don't still think that Peter is Satan. I don't know if you're picking up that reasoning or not. It's really is a little bit honestly, it's just silly. It's really kind of silly reasoning, and I'm going to read through a few parts of this article. The link to this article is in the comment section of this video, but I wanted to talk through a couple things, and then also I have a quick encouragement to give, and then I'm going to look at and respond. There's a couple comments. We just did a live Zoom conversation that a lot of you were a part of. And we do plan on doing more of those soon. We're trying to get a hold of Ray. Many of you heard the conversation we had with Ray, a current member, and I'm in contact with him, hoping that he will come on and do maybe just a conversation with me, or maybe also if you're a member and you want to jump on and do a conversation as well. Ideally, I think we'd like to do a one-on-one conversation, or even a two-on-two conversation. And you could probably call it a debate, is kind of what we're hoping to do, but do it in a respectful way. I think if you watch the video, you saw that we can have these discussions in a respectful way where we're honoring the other person, we're actually listening to what they say. And so I think that's what we want to do. So again, if you're a member, if you have any interest in coming on and sharing your side of the story, if you want to share refutations to things we've taught and said in the video, if you want to share defenses of your group and just talk with us about that, we really want to do that. We want to have, I think we're doing a lot of videos where it's kind of one-sided, where you're only able to hear our side of the story. When we make these videos and we're uploading them, you're just hearing our part, and we want this. We think the live aspect of this and the Zoom conversations, doing it in that format allows us to have a little bit more of a relational way of doing this, where we can actually talk back and forth with each other. And so, I'm just hoping to be able to do that more with you guys. We're hoping that you're willing to do that. I think it's just a lot more healthy and productive way to have these conversations, rather than trying to talk back and forth in YouTube comments. So let me jump into this book again, the argument of the WMSCOG about Satan. So pull this up here. So Ahnsahnghong In his book, Problems with the New Jerusalem, the Bride, and Women's Veils, he clearly and directly displayed that he did not believe in the existence of a mother god. And so he wrote this book to refute a woman named Ahnsahnghong who had begun to make assertions that she was a female deity, mother god. In this book, Ahnsahnghong gave his interpretation of passages from Revelation 21, 22, and Galatians 4, which were being used by Ahnsahnghong to purport her false views. These passages of scriptures are foundational to the WMSCOG doctrine of Mother God and stand as some of their most commonly used passages to support this doctrine. The problem for the WMSCOG arises from the fact that Ahnsahnghong's interpretation and views of these passages do not at all line up with theirs, but rather his views contradict and oppose them. Okay, and so here I'm going to get to, this is the commonly used argument, and this is how it goes to defend against that book. And if you're a member, if you're a new member, most likely there's a good chance you haven't heard about this book yet. If you've been in the church, or I don't want to call it a church, honestly, I keep trying to catch myself. I don't believe the WMSCOG is rightly classified as a church according to the standards of what the church is taught by Jesus. And so that's not said as an insult. I just I've been thinking recently I want to stop using that terminology when I refer to this group. So the argument, the defense that I've been seeing this in the comments over and over when we make videos about Ahnsahnghong's books. This is how it goes. They appeal to the event in Matthew 16:23, where Jesus calls Peter Satan. So they argue that since we don't insist today on Jesus' words that Peter is actually Satan, then in the same way we shouldn't insist today on Ahnsahnghong's words that Mother God does not exist. So if you have even a basic understanding of philosophical reasoning and logical argumentation, then there's a good chance you are appalled at the lack of logic in this argument. And so this argument, if you understand it rightly, is a faulty comparison or a false analogy. And it represents a common tendency of the WMSCOG to resort to fallacious and illogical forms of arguing to defend their doctrines. So this is, again, if you get this argument, in essence, it's just they're saying that because in that moment Jesus called Peter Satan, they equate that and say that's equal to Ahnsahnghong's book where he refutes the doctrine of Mother God. So I'm going to just kind of talk through quickly from this article why that just is not the case, and that does not, as I said just now and read from this article, it's a false analogy. And if you know anything about philosophy and philosophical arguments and logical ways of debate and arguing, then you know that what this argument that you just heard, the WMSCOG argument, it's a fallacious way of arguing. It's a philosophical fallacy. It's a false analogy. The instance of Jesus calling Peter Satan is not equal to, they're in completely different categories. They're not the same thing, and so you can't use that as a comparison. And so I'm going to explain why here. So in Matthew 16:23, Jesus, the biggest thing you need to realize, and right now I want to talk to you members who are relying on this argument to defend Ahnsahnghong's book. If you've heard of Ahnsahnghong's book, maybe you've been challenged by it. You thought, man, how do I deal with this book? What do I do with it? In this book, he's obviously saying things about your doctrine of Mother God, and so you have to figure out how do you defend it. And many of you have resorted to this argument. You've gone and you found the defense, and you can find this defense on some of the WMSCOG websites. I think the truewmscog.com or something like that is where I pulled an article to get, and I saw this argument laid out. But many of you, I think, are relying on this argument to defend your doctrine. And you're thinking, okay, well, since Jesus called Peter Satan in that instance, that means or you equate that to Ahnsahnghong's refutation. Here's why that doesn't work. So in Matthew 16:23, Jesus was not making a theological argument about Peter actually being Satan. He was simply recognizing that Peter's mind in that moment was set on the things of men and not the things of God. Therefore, in that moment, Peter was in a sense serving Satan's serving as Satan's mouthpiece to distract Jesus from his mission. Jesus recognized that Peter's words were in opposition to God's will, and so he rejected Peter's words as if they had come from Satan himself. And so, although in that moment Jesus called Peter Satan, he was not making a theological assertion that Peter was literally Satan. This should be obvious to anyone who simply reads through the text of Matthew 16:23 and examines it honestly. In contrast, though, when we examine Ahnsahnghong's book and the arguments he presents, it's clear that he was making theological assertions and presenting doctrinal positions. This is absolutely different than what Jesus was doing in Matthew 16. So if you don't know, is the woman that Ahnsahnghong wrote the book to refute. So he wrote this book against this woman, who was claiming to be Mother God. And so was using texts like Revelation 22, Galatians 4, and she was interpreting them as teaching the existence of a female deity of God. So was taking the text like Revelation 22, Galatians 4, and again, these are foundational scriptures that the WMSCOG today uses to teach the doctrine of Mother God. This is exactly what was doing. And so she takes these and interprets them as if they teach the existence of a female deity of God. And then she was applying them to herself and saying, these texts teach Mother God, and I'm Mother God, basically. So here's the kicker. Here's the thing that's significant. Ahnsahnghong specifically addressed these texts and made clear that in his view, they did not reveal a teaching about a female deity. This is something that I haven't really, at this point, I've not heard a legitimate response to this from the WMSCOG. And so first off, I encourage you guys who have left this church I'm solidifying, hopefully in your mind, that this group is false. And you see the contradiction here, that Ahnsahnghong himself had a different interpretation, a different understanding of texts like Galatians 4:22 through 26 and Revelation 21, 1 through 4, passages that the WMSCOG commonly uses, foundational passages that they use to teach their doctrine of Mother God. Ahnsahnghong taught a completely different view of them. He had a different interpretation of them, an interpretation that lines up more with my interpretation. And ultimately, he looked at these passages that the WMSCOG uses and used to teach Mother God, and he clearly and dogmatically showed that that's not what they're about. That's not what they teach. And so Ahnsahnghong displayed that their views of these scriptures stand in direct opposition to the views of Ahnsahnghong. And so the main thing here is that you got to see that Jesus calling Peter Satan wasn't a theological teaching that he was trying to establish. He wasn't literally saying, Peter, you are Satan. But in contrast, Ahnsahnghong was looking at these passages of scripture and he was making a theological statement, asserting a doctrinal position about these scriptures, and subsequently making a doctrinal position about Mother God. And what that means ultimately is that he was saying Mother God does not exist. By his interpretation of these passages, what you can pull out of that, what he was meaning to communicate, is that Mother God does not exist, and these passages do not teach her. So this is why this argument that is popping up in the comments over and over just does not work. And so here I want to show you what a good comparison would actually look like. Like if you wanted to go to the Bible and find a comparison that you could use to defend Ahnsahnghong's book, I'm going to explain what that would need to look like in order to be a logical and reasonable comparison. Okay, because the whole thing that I'm trying to get across here is the fact that the way that the WMSCOG compares Jesus calling Peter Satan to Ahnsahnghong refuting Mother God, that's just a false analogy. It's a false comparison. It doesn't work. You can't compare the two things because they're completely different circumstances. Ahnsahnghong had a completely different purpose for refuting Mother God than Jesus had for calling Peter Satan. The two they have nothing to do with each other, if you really understand it. And so here is what an actual comparison should or would look like. So let's say that during this moment in Matthew 16:23, again where Jesus calls Peter Satan, let's say, let me pull this up here. say, okay, so let's say that during this moment in Matthew 16:23, Jesus had taken out the scriptures and he began to examine all of the commonly used passages that Christians use to prove the existence of Satan. So I'm saying here, in that moment, let's say Jesus, he pulled out a scroll and he started looking at, passages like Genesis 2 through 3 and Job, chapters in Job where Satan is directly mentioned. So let's say he pulled out these scriptures and he looked at them, he read through them, and then he began to refute the commonly held view that Satan is a literal being who exists. So Christians and even the WMSCOG would look at passages like Genesis, look at passages like Job, and they would say, well, we see Satan taught here, and that means he must exist. He's an actual being who exists. Okay, so again, what I'm saying is, what if Jesus pulled out these scriptures that we commonly use and he started to refute them and started to show, no, these don't actually teach the existence of Satan? If that was the case, that would be very much comparable to what Ahnsahnghong was doing, where he looked at specific scriptures that the WMSCOG uses to teach the doctrine of Mother God. And Ahnsahnghong began to dismantle those views. He knew that Ahnsahnghong was using those to argue for the existence of Mother God. He took them and began to show why they don't teach that, but they teach something else. So if Matthew 16 actually served as a good argument for the WMSCOG, then this is what it would need to look like. This is an example of what we need to see in this passage for it to be a legitimate and logical comparison. So what if Jesus argued that the passages about Satan in the books of Genesis and Job actually did not teach that Satan literally exists, but instead they teach something entirely different? If that was the case, then this would stand as a legitimate correlation between what Ahnsahnghong did in his book when he refuted the existence of Mother God. And so let's go further. So now, let's say that after Jesus made his case, again, the case that the commonly used passages from Genesis and Job do not actually teach the existence of Satan. So let's say after he did this, later on, he actually began to teach that Satan does exist. And then the apostles began to also use the passages like Genesis and Job to prove Satan's existence. If you're following with me, this would be a comparable example or comparison between what Ahnsahnghong did if this was what we saw in Matthew 16. Okay, so the example I'm giving is what if we saw Jesus taking Genesis, Job, and other passages in the Old Testament that teach about Satan that we use to say, look, Satan exists, he's a real being, he's an actual person, or an actual being who exists, and he has an evil influence in the world. What if Jesus took those at this moment and he refuted them? He refuted our common understandings of them. That would be equal to what Ahnsahnghong did with his book when he refuted Mother God. And let's say then what happened with what happened in according to the WMSCOG, they say, well, Ahnsahnghong retracted the book where he refuted Mother God, and now the WMSCOG actually uses those very scriptures that Ahnsahnghong interpreted in a way that was against the doctrine of Mother God. The WMSCOG they use them to now teach the doctrine of Mother God. That if we looked in Matthew 16 and we saw Jesus first refuting Mother God in these or first refuting Satan in these passages, then later on, what if we saw Jesus retracting those and saying, no, Satan actually exists, and then we saw the disciples, as the WMSCOG is doing with the passages about Mother God today, what if the disciples then continue to use the passages that Jesus refuted to teach the doctrine of Satan? I know this might be a bit of a confusing argument. I hope you're following along, and if it is confusing, I'd encourage you again to look at this article and just read through it and try to understand the arguments being presented here. In essence, the point of this is that this would be a good example. If this is what we saw in the Bible, this would be a very good example that the WMSCOG could pull to and say, look, Jesus did something similar to what Ahnsahnghong did when he refuted Mother God. Okay? But here's the deal. Everything that I just said, this whole comparison that I just gave, it didn't happen. It didn't happen. Jesus didn't say anything like that. He in no way was he making he wasn't making a theological argument. Again, that's the main thing. He was simply making, in that moment, Peter was acting as Satan's mouthpiece. His mind was on the things of the world. And so when he was speaking things that were contrary to God's will. And so Jesus called him out by calling him Satan, but he wasn't literally calling him Satan. Ahnsahnghong was literally saying Mother God does not exist. He was literally making a theological, doctrinal statement, Mother God does not exist. Okay? Jesus was not making a theological, doctrinal statement that Peter was Satan, or that Satan doesn't exist, and then he later on retracted that. If he did, then my point is that would stand as a good argument for the WMSCOG to use. That would stand as a good comparison. The fact is, that didn't happen. That is not at all what you see in Matthew 16:23. And so your guys' use of this, to you who are using this in the comments, to you, even if just in your own mind, if you've heard about Ahnsahnghong's book, and if this is the passage you're using to comfort yourself and to encourage yourself that, oh, it's okay that Ahnsahnghong wrote this book because I can settle it in my mind by referring to Matthew 16:23 in this circumstance where Jesus called Peter Satan. If you're doing that, you need to stop, okay? Because that argument is horrible. It's terrible. It doesn't work. And I'm not saying that as an insult. I'm just saying logically, just go look up in Google, just Google faulty analogy or false comparison, and you'll see that this argument that the WMSCOG uses lines up perfectly with what a false analogy is. Okay, so finally the conclusion of that is that when we examine the WMSCOG's usage of Matthew 16 as a defense of Ahnsahnghong's book, it becomes clear that this defense simply does not work. Ahnsahnghong's book still stands as a significant problem to the WMSCOG doctrine of Mother God, and it further solidifies the mounting evidence against them that they are a dangerous cult. Okay, so when I say these things, this is, to some, this would sound as hard, mean, rude language. When I call you a cult, I'm not doing that as an attack or insult. I'm not directing this to you individual members. I'm directing this to the organization itself. I'm directing this toward the ideas, the concepts, the doctrines themselves. Those are the things that I'm angry at. Those are the things that I would speak harshly against. I don't want to speak harshly against any person unless you yourself are obstinately hardening your heart and rebelling to the truth. Then I think there's a time to speak harshly to people. But right now, I hope that this is removed. You guys who are relying on this argument to defend Ahnsahnghong's book, it doesn't work. It simply doesn't work. So please, I would ask you to stop using that in the comments, because it doesn't work. It's just a bad argument. And as you continue to use that argument, as you grab onto that instance of Jesus calling Peter Satan as a defense of Ahnsahnghong's book, what you're really showing, what the WMSCOG shows, is that they don't even understand what's going on in Matthew 16. In that instance, they don't understand the spiritual significance. They don't even understand the meaning of that passage. If they understood it, that they would realize that when they compare it to Ahnsahnghong's book, it's a false analogy. It's a false comparison, because the two are completely different things. And I just hope you see that.